During Sunday dinner, a 16-year-old girl knocked on our door, and when my adult son answered, she asked him, "Are you my dad?" I heard the words from the kitchen where I was plating dessert. Through the doorway, I saw Garrett frozen, his face draining of color. Behind me, my husband Victor shifted uncomfortably. The girl stood nervous but determined. "My mom said you'd know why she left town when she was pregnant with me. She said your family knows what happened but pretends they don't." She shifted her weight. "I need to know the truth about why my mom cries every time I ask about you." My mind started racing to one thing and one thing only. "Garrett, who is this?" The girl turned to me. "I'm Luna. My mom's name is Bethany Caston. She was 14 when she got pregnant with me. You were at her school, weren't you? She said you led some kind of campaign against her." My stomach lurched. Bethany Caston, the freshman who accused Garrett of rape his senior year. "Oh my God," I whispered. Victor stood up like he was hiding something. "We should talk privately." "No," I said, my voice sharp. "You raped her. You actually raped that 14-year-old girl." I said to Garrett, "Mom, it wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" I turned to Luna. "Your mother was 14, a freshman. He was 18. The room was spinning. I defended you," I said to Garrett, my voice breaking. "I lost my best friend Janet defending you." The memories flooded back. "I called your mother a liar," I said to Luna. "At the PTA meeting, I stood up and said she was trying to trap a good boy. I organized a support rally for him at school, made t-shirts that said, 'Justice for Garrett.'" Luna's voice was quiet. "Mom said you were the scariest part, the way you came after her. I cornered her mother in the grocery store, told her to control her daughter. I was so sure." I turned to Garrett. Luna spoke up suddenly. "Mom said the money helped at first, even though she didn't want to take it." I froze. "What money?" She looked confused. "The checks your husband sent. Mom said they came every month for 5 years. She kept copies of everything, said it was the only proof she had that your family knew the truth." I turned slowly to Victor. "You sent them money?" His face was gray. "Diane, you knew. You knew he raped her and you paid them off?" "Mom kept records," Luna said quietly. $50,000 total. She said it was blood money, but she was 15 with a baby. She had to take it. $50,000? I screamed. While I was having panic attacks about losing the house. While I skipped meals so the kids could eat. While I sold my mother's jewelry, my wedding china, everything I had. "I was protecting our family," Victor started. "I missed my father's funeral because I couldn't afford the plane ticket. I told my family we had the flu, but really we had no money for gas." Tears were streaming now. "I developed ulcers from the stress. My hair fell out in chunks. My coworkers started a secret fund to buy me lunch because they knew I wasn't eating. I was culling myself working while you were paying off a great victim. The overtime destroyed my body," I continued. I looked at Luna. "While your 15-year-old mother raised you alone. At least she knew the truth. I was destroying myself for a lie. Mom still has nightmares," Luna said softly, "about the rally you organized, the shirts, the way the whole town turned on her. She said you made her feel like she deserved it. I might have driven her to suicide if she'd stayed," I admitted, the truth bitter. "I hated her that much. This child who ruined my perfect son's life. You let me become a monster defending a monster," I said to both of them. "You watched me transform into someone cruel enough to terrorize a pregnant 14-year-old, and you said nothing." Victor reached for me. "Diane, please, don't touch me. 23 years of marriage built on blood money." I looked at Luna. "Your mother is braver than all of us. Tell her she was right. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I'll never be able to make it up to her, but the least I can do is try." Garrett was crying. "Mom, I was young, old enough to grape, old enough to lie, old enough to watch me die slowly paying for your crime." I grabbed my phone. "What are you doing?" Victor asked. "Calling the police. Then every friend I lost. Then Bethany Caston, if she'll ever speak to me." I looked at Luna. "I'll testify. Whatever your mother needs, I'll do it." "The statute of limitations," Victor started. "There's no statute of limitations on the truth," I said, "or on what you did with that money. Financial fraud, conspiracy, who knows what else." Luna was backing toward the door. "Tell your mother the woman who terrorized her is finally going to make it right." She nodded and ran. I turned to the men I'd wasted my life protecting. "Get out, both of you." Victor grabbed my arm. "Think about what you're doing." I looked at his hand, the same hand that signed those checks while I was dying of poverty. "I know exactly what I'm doing. For the first time in 16 years, I know exactly what I'm doing. The police would be here soon, and I had so much to tell them." 20 minutes later, I heard the patrol car pull up outside, and my hand started shaking so bad I had to put down my phone. 2 officers came to the door, both looking young enough to be in college, and I let them in while Victor and Garrett were still standing frozen in the living room. The younger officer pulled out his notepad while the older one asked me to explain what happened. I told them everything, the words pouring out fast about how Luna showed up saying she was Bethany Caston's daughter, how my son had raped Bethany when she was 14 and he was 18, how my husband paid them $50,000 over 5 years while I nearly killed myself working overtime to pay bills. My voice kept breaking, but I kept talking, explaining how I organized rallies against a 14-year-old victim, made t-shirts, cornered her mother at the grocery store, all while my husband knew the truth and said nothing. The officers took notes carefully, the younger one's eyes getting wider as I talked, and Victor tried to interrupt twice, but the older officer told him to wait his turn. Garrett just sat there crying silently, while I explained how I lost my best friend defending him, how I developed ulcers from stress, how my hair fell out, all while Victor was secretly sending checks to the girl our son raped. The older officer said a detective would contact me tomorrow for a formal statement and asked if I felt safe staying here tonight. I said yes, even though I knew I was lying, because I couldn't stand the thought of being in this house another minute. After they left, taking statements from Victor and Garrett separately, I sat alone in the empty living room and pulled out my phone to text Luna. I typed out my number and told her I meant everything I said about helping her mother, that I would do whatever Bethany needed to feel safe, that I knew sorry wasn't enough, but I would spend the rest of my life trying to make this right. Luna didn't text back right away, which made perfect sense because why would she trust the woman who terrorized her mother? I couldn't stay in this house with all its lies, so I went upstairs and threw clothes into a bag, grabbing my toothbrush and medications and chargers. Before leaving, I went into Victor's home office, which he always kept locked, but the key was in his desk drawer where he thought I didn't know about it. I took photos of every document I could find in our shared files, bank statements and tax returns and business records, anything that might show where that $50,000 came from. His filing cabinet had folders labeled by year, and I photographed those too, noticing how organized he kept everything while lying to my face for 16 years. I wondered what other secrets were hiding in these locked drawers, what other lies he'd been keeping while I was destroying my body with overtime shifts. The cheap motel on Route 9 had rooms for $60 a night, and I paid cash because I didn't want Victor tracking my credit card. The room smelled like old cigarettes and the carpet had stains, but at least it was honest about what it was, not pretending to be something better while hiding ugly truths. I sat on the scratchy bedspread and stared at my phone, waiting for Luna to text back, jumping every time it buzzed with some stupid notification. Around midnight, she finally responded saying her mom was still processing everything, but they'd kept all the evidence from back then. She said Bethany saved every check, every envelope with our return address, even the cruel t-shirt from my rally that said Justice for Garrett. My stomach turned knowing that shirt existed somewhere. Physical proof of how I'd attacked a child who'd already been through hell. Luna said her mom had taken photos of everything and kept copies in a safety deposit box because she always knew someday the truth might matter. I barely slept that night, just lay there staring at the water stains on the ceiling and thinking about Bethany keeping those checks for 16 years. At 8 in the morning, my phone rang and a man identified himself as Detective Jeff Burgess from the police department. His voice was professional, but I could hear something underneath it. Maybe judgment, or maybe just exhaustion from dealing with people like my family. He said he needed me to come in for a formal interview this afternoon and to bring any documentation I had related to the case. I told him I had photos of financial documents and he said to bring those too, that financial crimes sometimes had longer statutes of limitations than other offenses. Before the interview, I sat in my car outside the police station and called Janet's old number, not even knowing if she still had it after all these years. Her voicemail picked up with the same message from years ago, and I left a rambling message saying she was right about everything, that Garrett had done it, that I was sorry for choosing him over our friendship. I wonder what made Luna track down this family after all these years. Seems like there's something specific driving her to confront them now instead of staying quiet like her mother did for so long. My voice cracked when I mentioned the rally I organized and how I'd been so cruel to everyone who tried to tell me the truth. I sent my boss a quick email saying I had a family emergency and needed immediate leave, not mentioning that the emergency was something I'd helped create 16 years ago. He approved it within minutes, probably hearing something serious in my vague explanation, and I was grateful I didn't have to explain yet. Detective Burgess met me in the lobby and led me to a small interview room with a camera in the corner and a recorder on the table. I told him everything again, this time with more detail about the PTA meeting where I called Bethany's mother a liar in front of everyone, about the rally where we marched through town with those horrible shirts, about cornering people at the grocery store and demanding they support my son. The shame felt like drowning, but I kept talking, explaining how Victor let me work myself nearly to death while secretly paying off our son's victim, how he watched me lose everything defending a lie. Detective Burgess took notes and asked specific questions about the payments, when they started, how they were sent, whether they came from personal or business accounts. He explained that prosecuting the sexual assault would be nearly impossible after all this time, but the financial aspects might have potential, especially if the payments were hidden from taxes or came from business funds, that conspiracy and fraud charges could still apply. He said it wasn't the justice Bethany deserved, but it might be something, and I said anything that held them accountable was better than the nothing she'd gotten so far. That evening, my phone rang while I was sitting in the motel room staring at the water stains on the ceiling. Luna's voice was quiet when she asked if I really meant what I said about helping her mother. I told her yes, but that Bethany had to decide everything about if and when we talked. She said she'd ask her mom about maybe starting with lawyers handling any contact first. My phone buzzed with texts from Victor right after I hung up. The first one said he'd been protecting our family all these years, and I was throwing it all away. I typed back that all communication had to go through lawyers now and started taking screenshots of everything. 12 more texts came through that I didn't open, but I photographed the notification screen showing them all lined up. The next morning, I walked into the legal aid office downtown, where a tired-looking attorney named Sarah explained that any defamation claims against me were probably past the statute of limitations, but my reputation was already destroyed anyway. She pulled out forms and started listing the financial problems I'd face if Victor's crimes affected our joint accounts, and I realized the real consequences were just starting. My phone rang while I was signing papers, and Janet's name appeared on the screen for the first time in 16 years. Her voice was ice cold when she answered, but she was willing to talk. She told me about losing 3 other friends who sided with Bethany, and how everyone assumed she was lying too just for believing a victim. She said I'd turned the whole town into a weapon against a child, and she was right. That night, back in the motel, I couldn't stop picturing 15-year-old Bethany holding baby Luna while I was printing those rally shirts in my garage. I kept thinking about her crying when Luna asked about her father and having to pack up and leave everything she knew because of what we did to her. The digital clock next to the bed showed 3:47 a.m., and I was still awake thinking about those t-shirts and how proud I'd been wearing one. Sleep finally came as the sun started coming through the thin curtains, but even then I dreamed about that pregnant 14-year-old girl we'd driven out of town. I woke up 3 hours later with my mind made up about facing Bethany if she'd let me. The motel shower had rust stains and barely any water pressure, but I stood under it trying to wash off 16 years of being wrong. I put on the plainest clothes I had in my bag because this wasn't about trying to look good for anyone. 2 days later, Luna called to say her mom agreed to meet at Jonas Newton's law office where she felt safe with people around. When I walked into that conference room, Bethany was already there looking straight at the wall behind me instead of at my face. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she said I had 5 minutes to talk, and then she'd decide if we ever communicated again. I started talking about how wrong I'd been, but she held up her hand and said she didn't want apologies, just accountability. Luna sat next to her mother holding her her hand, and I could see her watching Bethany's face, ready to step in if needed. From where Luna was sitting, she could probably see the box her mom had brought with the old rally shirt visible on top, and I wondered if Bethany carried it everywhere as evidence. I kept talking about what I'd told the police and the lawyers while Bethany stared at that spot on the wall, and Luna squeezed her mom's hand tighter. When my 5 minutes ended, Bethany stood up without looking at me and said her lawyer would be in touch if she decided to proceed with anything. Detective Burgess called me later to say he'd collected copies of the checks and envelopes from Bethany that afternoon. He said they were from Victor's business account and labeled as consulting fees to something called BK Services, which meant to hide what they really were. He mentioned this could be tax fraud on top of everything else, since Victor probably deducted them as business expenses. The detective said Bethany had kept everything in a safety deposit box for 16 years, including the envelopes with postmarks and Victor's business return address labels. Each check had a memo line with fake invoice numbers that Bethany said she'd never provided because there was no real business relationship. Burgess said the federal implications made this bigger than just state charges, and that the IRS would probably get involved now too. He asked if I had access to our tax returns from those years, and I told him they were in a filing cabinet at the house I couldn't go back to. He said they'd get a warrant for those records and warned me I might need my own criminal lawyer soon since we'd filed joint returns. The whole house of cards was falling apart, and every card that fell revealed another crime underneath. The next morning, I drove to the old print shop on Main Street where I'd ordered those awful shirts 16 years ago. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I had to pull over twice to throw up. The shop looked exactly the same with its faded awning and dusty window display. The owner, an older man with thick glasses, looked up when I walked in. I told him I needed records from 2008 for a t-shirt order I'd placed. He squinted at me, and then his face changed like he remembered something bad. He said he keeps everything for 20 years for tax purposes and went to the back room. I could hear him moving boxes around, and my stomach kept turning. He came back with a thick folder and found the invoice right away. There was my signature at the bottom, ordering 200 shirts that said, "Justice for Garrett," with my son's school photo on them. He made copies without me asking and handed them over with this look like he knew what they were for. I paid him for the copies and left fast. Meanwhile, Victor had locked himself in his home office after I'd kicked him out. He was sitting at his desk with a legal pad, writing down every payment he'd made to Bethany. He kept telling himself he'd done the right thing, that the money had helped her and protected our family. He was already thinking about how to explain it to his lawyer as business expenses or consulting fees. He had no idea Detective J. Delgado was already getting a warrant for his financial records. Delgado specialized in white-collar crime and loved cases where rich people thought they were too smart to get caught. When Delgado called me 2 days later, he asked for our tax returns from those years. I told him they were at the house, but I couldn't go back there with Victor around. He said they'd handle getting them with a warrant and asked if I knew about any other accounts. I mentioned Victor's locked office where he kept his business records separate from our household stuff. Delgado seemed really interested in that detail. At the same time, Garrett was typing up a Facebook post from his apartment. He wrote about how people were trying to destroy him over a high school misunderstanding that happened years ago. He claimed it was all consensual and that Bethany had just regretted it later. Within an hour, screenshots were everywhere and people were arguing in the comments. Some of his old friends defended him, but others were calling him out. He kept refreshing the page, not understanding why this was happening now after all these years. He thought if he just explained his side, people would move on. The next morning, I went to the courthouse to request copies of the PTA and school board meeting minutes from 2008. The clerk was a woman about my age who gave me this weird look when I asked for them. She remembered the whole thing and processed my request slowly, like she was studying me. She said the records would show everything that was said publicly, including my speech at the PTA meeting. I nodded and paid the fee, knowing those records would prove what I'd done. While I was doing that, Bethany was 3 states away writing an email to her therapist. She explained how the school counselor back then had told her to stay quiet about what happened. The counselor had said reporting would only make things worse for her, and that she should just transfer schools. Bethany forwarded this email to Detective Burgess as proof that the school had failed to protect her. There's something really strange about Victor keeping such detailed business records of payments he was trying to hide. You'd think someone committing fraud would be more careful about the paper trail he left behind. The counselor was retired now, but would have to answer questions about why she'd discouraged a 14-year-old from reporting. By that afternoon, a local blog had picked up Garrett's Facebook post and was running with the story. They didn't have all the details yet, but they were asking questions about the old case. My phone started ringing with a call from my employer's HR department. They asked if I needed support and suggested I extend my leave while this was all happening. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control it now. Luna was at her mom's house going through old boxes in the attic. She found a manila envelope marked 2008 and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter in feminine handwriting that said, "Bethany better stop lying or else." The postmark was from right after the rally I'd organized. Luna took photos of everything and texted them to Detective Burgess immediately. She could tell from the handwriting it wasn't from a teenager. Detective Burgess got the letter to forensics within hours. They found partial fingerprints on the paper and started comparing the handwriting to samples from that time. Burgess called me the next day to say they were building a case about community harassment. It wasn't just me who had terrorized Bethany, but a whole group of parents and students. The letter was just one piece of evidence showing how bad it had gotten. 3 days later, I met with ADA Cohen in his office downtown. He suggested we consider a restorative justice process along with the criminal case. He warned me that anything I said could be used against me in court. I told him I didn't care about the legal risks anymore. Bethany deserved to be heard after 16 years of silence, and I needed to face what I'd done. The legal consequences were nothing compared to living with the truth of how I'd destroyed a child's life. Detective Delgado called me 2 days later while I was making breakfast. He'd found something in Victor's business records that made my stomach drop. The payments to BK Services were listed as vendor reimbursements in the books. $20,000 spread over 5 years, exactly like Luna said. Each check marked as office supplies or consulting fees. The detective sent me photos of the bank statements on my phone. I could see Victor's signature on every single one. The dates matched up with when I was working 3 jobs, when I was selling plasma twice a week for grocery money, when I wore the same 2 outfits for months because I couldn't afford new clothes. Victor must have known what I was finding because he tried calling me 17 times that morning. I didn't answer. His voicemails got more and more frantic. He said his lawyer told him not to touch anything on his computer, said he'd thought about deleting files but everything was backed up to the cloud anyway, said destroying evidence would make things worse. I listened to him panic and felt nothing. The police showed up at our house the next morning with a search warrant. I stood in the doorway watching them carry out boxes from Victor's home office. They took his desktop computer, his laptop, 3 external hard drives. They bagged up years of financial records. Victor wasn't home, but his lawyer arrived within 10 minutes. That meant Victor had been expecting this. The lawyer kept telling the officers they were overreaching. The detective just kept loading boxes into the van. I gave them the password to Victor's filing cabinet without being asked. Janet finally agreed to meet me for coffee after I sent her 14 texts. She picked a place downtown where nobody would know us. Her hands shook when she pulled out her phone. She had saved a voicemail I'd left her 16 years ago. My voice came through the speaker full of rage. I was calling her a traitor for believing that girl's lies, saying she was jealous of my perfect family, telling her she'd regret choosing a stranger over her best friend. I didn't remember leaving it, but hearing my own voice made me throw up in the coffee shop bathroom. Janet didn't offer forgiveness when I came back to the table. I didn't ask for it. She just said she'd kept the voicemail to remind herself she made the right choice. Then she left without finishing her coffee. Garrett agreed to meet me at a park 3 towns over where nobody would recognize us. He showed up 20 minutes late and wouldn't look me in the eye. He kept saying a teacher had told him back then that Bethany was just trying to get attention, that girls sometimes regret things and make up stories, that the whole thing was complicated. He wouldn't say the word rape. He kept calling it a misunderstanding. I realized my son was a coward who would never take responsibility for what he did. He left when I started crying. Detective Burgess tracked down the teacher Garrett mentioned and went to interview him. The teacher immediately called a lawyer and claimed he didn't remember details from 16 years ago. Burgess told me later the man was sweating through his shirt during questioning. The teacher let slip that the principal back then had pressured staff to support Garrett, said the school didn't want a scandal. The detective was opening a wider investigation into the school's handling of the situation. Luna went to visit the high school on her own and sent me photos later. She'd found one of our Justice for Garrett rally flyers still tucked behind a trophy case. The paper was yellow and faded, but you could still read the words. She said she stood there thinking about her mom walking these halls pregnant while everyone wore those shirts, while everyone called her a liar, while I led rallies in the gym. The building felt haunted by all that cruelty, she texted me. Ada Cohen scheduled a meeting with me and Bethany's lawyer to discuss charges. Bethany came too, but didn't speak. Cohen said he could pursue tax fraud and conspiracy charges against Victor. The financial crimes were clear-cut, but Garrett remained untouchable for the rape because of the statute of limitations. I watched Bethany's jaw clench when he said those words, watched her hands ball into fists under the table. They discussed her trauma in legal terms like she wasn't sitting right there, like she was evidence instead of a person. I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper when I left the courthouse. Someone had written that I was a traitor for turning on my own family, that I should be ashamed, that karma would get me for destroying good people's lives. I filed a police report and added it to the growing pile of evidence. The same people who'd supported me at those rallies were angry at me now for telling the truth. 3 more notes showed up over the next week. Bethany's lawyer told me later that Bethany had gone to her support group to talk about possibly doing restorative justice. She'd set firm conditions, though. I had to publicly acknowledge what happened. I had to contribute to victim advocacy organizations. I had to never contact her directly without permission. The support group was helping her practice maintaining boundaries with people who'd hurt her. Her therapist said it was a big step for her to even consider letting me try to make amends. 2 weeks later, the bank records came through and the forensic accountant called me with shock in his voice. Victor had written off every single payment to Bethany as a business expense for 16 years. He'd marked them as consulting fees and contractor payments on the company books. The accountant said it was the most blatant tax fraud he'd seen in 20 years of doing this work. He found receipts where Victor had claimed the money as deductions while telling the IRS it was for legitimate business services. The evidence showed Victor saved almost $20,000 in taxes by lying about what those payments were really for. I sat in the accountant's office staring at spreadsheets that proved my husband had been committing federal crimes for over a decade. Meanwhile, Victor was falling apart, and his lawyer called me saying Victor wanted to talk, but I refused. The lawyer said Victor was desperate and making mistakes, but I didn't care anymore. 3 days later, Victor's lawyer called again, and this time I could hear Victor yelling in the background. The lawyer put him on speaker by accident, and I heard Victor screaming about how he'd handled everything perfectly for years. Then he said something about the forms he'd changed without telling me, and his lawyer immediately started shouting at him to stop talking. Victor had just admitted to forgery on a recorded line with witnesses. His own lawyer hung up on him and called back an hour later begging me not to use what I'd heard. Detective Delgado showed up at my door the next morning with a folder full of documents. He spread them out on my kitchen table and pointed to signatures that were supposed to be mine. The handwriting was close, but not quite right, and I'd never seen these papers before. They were business forms that moved money around without my knowledge, even though I was listed as co-owner. Delgado said this was criminal forgery on top of everything else. I called a divorce lawyer that afternoon, and she told me to freeze all joint accounts immediately. She said Victor's crimes meant I could protect myself financially, and she'd make sure I wasn't liable for his fraud. We spent 3 hours going through financial records and finding more evidence of Victor's deception. Jonas Newton called me the next day saying he was representing Bethany and Luna in civil proceedings. He explained they could sue Victor for the original assault, the cover-up, and ongoing harassment. They could also sue Garrett for defamation and emotional distress from his his recent behavior. He said the school district might be liable too, since teachers had participated in bullying Bethany back then. Newton said Bethany wasn't interested in getting rich, but wanted accountability and funds for therapy she'd needed for 16 years. Why would Victor keep such obvious paper trails if he knew he was committing crimes? His lawyer seems pretty worried about all these recorded admissions he's making. Makes me wonder if Victor thought he was untouchable this whole time. He mentioned they had records of every payment, every threat, and every instance of harassment from our family. The evidence was overwhelming, and any jury would side with them completely. That same week, Garrett's employer called him into HR and suspended him pending investigation. Someone had sent them screenshots of Garrett's social media posts from the past few days. He'd been posting angry rants calling Bethany a gold digger and a liar who was trying to destroy our family. He wrote that she'd probably planned the whole thing to get money and attention. His employer said the posts violated their code of conduct and showed poor judgment that reflected badly on the company. Garrett didn't understand that his own words were proving he'd learned nothing in 16 years. He kept posting more angry messages even after the suspension, making everything worse for himself. Newton screenshotted every single post and added them to a folder labeled defamation evidence. He sent Garrett a cease and desist letter ordering him to stop posting about Bethany and Luna immediately. The letter said if Garrett continued, they'd pursue harassment charges and a restraining order. Newton told Bethany they had enough evidence for multiple lawsuits that could bankrupt both Victor and Garrett. He said Garrett's recent posts showed a pattern of victim blaming that would destroy any defense he might try to mount. Meanwhile, Luna had been watching her mother struggle with panic attacks and nightmares since this all started. She convinced Bethany to consider meeting with me in a controlled setting with a mediator present. Luna said her mom had been carrying this alone for too long and maybe structured accountability could help. Bethany was terrified but agreed to think about it if there were strict safety rules. She wanted the mediator to be a trauma specialist, and she wanted her therapist present too. She also wanted me to sign papers acknowledging what I'd done before we met. The mediation happened a month later in a therapist's office with everyone following Bethany's rules. I sat across from her and apologized while she listed every single thing my actions had caused. She talked about dropping out of school because of the bullying I'd organized. She described raising Luna in poverty while we lived in a nice house 10 minutes away. She said she'd had nightmares about the rally I organized where students wore those awful t-shirts. She told me about the times she'd seen me at the store and had panic attacks in the parking lot. She explained how my campaign against her had made her feel worthless and dirty for years. She said she'd attempted suicide twice because she believed the things I'd said about her. She didn't offer forgiveness and said she might never be able to forgive any of us. I told her I understood and would accept whatever she needed to heal. After the mediation, I worked with Prosecutor Cohen to write a public statement taking responsibility. Every word had to be checked by lawyers to make sure it didn't compromise the criminal cases. I couldn't say certain things that might affect the prosecution, but I could acknowledge my role in harassing a child. The statement took 2 weeks to perfect with everyone reviewing every sentence. Cohen said it was important to get it right because it would be part of the public record forever. The school board meeting came 3 weeks later and the room was packed with people. I stood at the podium and asked them to correct the official record about what happened to Bethany. Half the room started yelling that I was betraying my family and ruining my son's life. Others shouted support, saying it was time for the truth to come out finally. I kept talking through all the noise and chaos around me. Janet suddenly stood up from the back row and everyone turned to look at her. She walked to the second microphone they'd set up for public comments, and her hands were shaking when she grabbed it. She told them about the rally I'd organized and how it created a culture where anyone who believed Bethany was called a traitor to the school. She said she lost most of her friends for suggesting we should listen to a 14-year-old girl's story. She described watching a pregnant child get spit on in the hallways while teachers looked away because they didn't want to go against the mob I'd created. Her voice broke when she said she'd never forget seeing Bethany crying alone at her locker with baby bumps showing while kids threw paper at her with awful words written on them. She wouldn't look at me the whole time she talked, and I felt my stomach turning inside out. The room got quiet when she finished and sat back down. 3 days later, we all got called to the prosecutor's office for an update on the case. The assistant district attorney sat us down and explained they couldn't pursue the assault charges because too much time had passed, but they were moving forward with financial crimes charges against Victor. It felt like someone punched me in the gut even though we knew this was probably coming. Bethany grabbed Luna's hand and they both left quickly without saying anything, and they looked so tired I wanted to run after them, but knew I had no right. The next morning, 2 detectives showed up at our house with an arrest warrant for Victor. They charged him with tax fraud and falsifying business records and attempted obstruction of justice. The judge set his bail at $50,000, which was exactly what he'd paid Bethany all those years ago. His lawyer tried to argue that the bail amount was prejudicial and meant to send a message, but the judge shut him down fast. I watched them put handcuffs on him and lead him out while neighbors stood on their lawns staring at us. That night, Garrett posted on social media that this was all lies and manipulation and that his family was destroyed by false accusations. I stared at his post for 20 minutes before typing my response that I wouldn't have any contact with him unless he took full accountability for what he did to Bethany. My hands shook as I hit post because cutting off my son felt like ripping out part of my heart, but I knew enabling him had created this whole mess. Within minutes, people started attacking me in the comments saying I was betraying my own child. The next day, I wrote out my full apology statement and posted it everywhere I could think of. I watched my phone blow up as former friends called me a traitor and said I'd lost my mind. People who'd stood with me at that rally 16 years ago now said I was destroying an innocent man's life. I lost 200 followers in the first hour, and the messages got worse and worse. Someone posted my home address saying people should show me what happens to mothers who betray their sons. My sister called crying and asking if I'd had a mental breakdown. 3 of my cousins blocked me on everything. People I'd known since high school were posting that I'd always been unstable, and this proved it. A week later, Janet sent me an email about a fundraiser she was organizing for the local Assault Victim Advocacy Center. She laid out strict conditions saying I could help with logistics like booking venues and handling paperwork, but I couldn't be a public face of the event. She said survivors wouldn't feel safe if the woman who'd terrorized a victim was front and center. It was more grace than I deserved, and I accepted immediately and thanked her for even letting me help at all. I spent the next 2 weeks making calls and filling out permit applications and doing all the behind-the-scenes work while staying completely out of sight. The school board announced at their next meeting that they were reviewing how they'd handled assault allegations from that whole era. They set up a historical complaint hotline for anyone who'd been silenced or ignored back then. Within 3 days, 3 more women came forward with similar stories from around that same time. They all described being called liars and troublemakers when they tried to report what happened to them. One said a teacher told her she was ruining a good boy's future over teenage mistakes. Another said the principal suggested she transfer schools if she couldn't handle normal teenage behavior. The third one said she'd been pushed down the stairs after reporting her assault, and everyone said she was clumsy. The pattern was so clear and so ugly that even people who'd been defending Garrett started going quiet. Thanks for sticking with me through all of this. It's been quite a journey wondering alongside you. Until next time, subscribe for more content like this.